Today is July 6th, 2011. I'm Julian Reitman, and the camcorder operator is Les Sharlock, and the two of us have gathered to interview somebody we've known for many, many years, Stan Pelter, here in his home in Stamford, Connecticut. So with that, getting started, we'll say good morning, Stan.
Good morning to you, gentlemen.
Stan, you were born in Brooklyn?
Actually, I was born in New York City, and my parents moved to Brooklyn when I was, probably 3 or 3.5 years old. And we, for the most part, lived in an area of Brooklyn which was called Flatbush. And I attended grade school there, I attended high school there, and eventually I went to St. John's University, which was also at that time in Brooklyn.
What sort of occupation did your dad have?
My father, like most immigrants, came to this country as a young man, and a cousin of mine went to the steamship company in England where he sailed to this country. I think he was about 10 years old or 13 years old. And he got the original manifest from that trip. And my father came to this country and he had $10 to his name. And his father was always sort of in the garment business in Europe. And my father graduated towards that. And so he was always in the garment industry in different areas all his life. And eventually I sort of followed him by going into a profession that had to do with sewing. So I was involved in sewing operations.
But before we get to that, you went to St. John's.
Yeah.
What were you studying at St. John's?
I was studying accounting.
Accounting?
Yeah.
Okay. And then you were interrupted with World War II?
I was going into my my junior year, and I was listening to the radio one Sunday morning, and listening to a football game, and the game was interrupted. There was an announcement on the loudspeaker at the stadium that all servicemen should immediately report back to their units. And everybody was confused what this was all about. And eventually they announced that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. And the next morning, which was December 8th, at 5 o'clock in the morning, I had my little bag packed, and I was about to leave the house, and my mother grabbed me, and she said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Mom, I gotta go, okay?" She already had 2 sons in the service. She was crying, and I left. And when I got down to the recruiting station in Manhattan, it was very early in the morning. I thought nobody would be there. Instead, there were blocks long men standing in line waiting to enlist. And so that's what I did on December 8th, I enlisted.
And where did you end up?
Well, like most servicemen, all over, but I wasn't in the service. When I enlisted in the Air Corps. I wanted to fly, okay? And, but I wasn't in the service very long, maybe 2 months, and all of a sudden I found myself on a ship heading someplace, I didn't know where. It turned out to be an island in the Caribbean called Trinidad that I had maybe just heard about, just about had heard about. And that was an interesting trip. That was just right at the beginning of the war. We went down on a ship that really wasn't built for ocean traveling. It was a boat that was really used for vacationers going from Boston to Halifax, that type of thing. And we were on the ship, a couple of thousand guys, and we sailed out of New Orleans. As I say, I was only in the service maybe 2 months. And on the way down, of course, this is when the Nazis were really sinking all the vessels, all the ships. And we passed lots of guys floating in the water, some of which got picked up. The ones who weren't alive didn't get picked up. And I had, excuse me, a number of interesting stories about that trip. One of the things that happened, first night I got aboard ship, they put us in a hold of the ship, you know, the bottom below the water line, and they had racks built out of 2x3s, and that's where we slept at. Well, first night we were pooped, and we all went and slept and didn't wake up. Next morning we were at sea, and I looked around and I saw there were a couple of thousand men in a hold of the ship, and the only way to get to the top, to get onto the first deck, there was a narrow stairway that they had built out of 2x3s, and it was kind of rickety. And I wondered what would happen if we were torpedoed and all of us had to get out of the hole going up this 3-foot staircase, a rickety staircase. So I decided after that I wasn't going to sleep there. So I slept at different places, but the best place that I slept at, they had a number of lifeboats. And these lifeboats had canvas covering them so the water shouldn't get in. And they were on a 45-degree angle, so in case they had to launch them, they just cut the rope and a lifeboat went right into the sea. So I slept on this lifeboat on this 45-degree angle, and I found a piece of rope and I tied it around myself, and that's how I slept. That was one of the things I remember most.
Now, did you have any evidence that there was anti-Semitism in the Air Corps that you experienced?
Yes, I experienced some. Down in Trinidad, we had a couple of guys in our outfit who were construction workers. They worked on road crews, okay? When we got to Trinidad, it was all jungle, and we built an airfield there, and these fellows, you know, did the paving and the grading and all, and they were sort of prima donnas because they were very important. And they didn't run the outfit, but they had a lot to say. And they were anti-Semitic, no question about it. They never come out and said anything, but you knew who was getting promoted and who wasn't, and that type of thing. The other thing I just want to mention on that trip was an interesting thing. There was no mess hall on a ship big enough for a couple of thousand men. So what they did is they took a piece of maybe 1x3 or 1x4, and they nailed it around the railing on the ship. And so what we did is we had a mess kit, and they filled it up with food, and we laid it on the 1x4, and that's how we ate standing up there. And that was okay, except that I would say that 80% of the guys on that ship got seasick. Some of these guys, they laid down the first night, and I don't think they moved until we got to Trinidad, which was several weeks later. And the interesting thing is, of course, they kept heaving up. And if you were on the first deck and you had your mess kit laying, and there was a guy on the third deck who was eating and heaving, if you were lucky enough, you caught all of it. So after that, I decided I only eat on the third deck. Those are just some of the stories. Of course, there's a lot of things that happen. As I say, we built an airfield in the jungle, and Trinidad was not an important part of the war. However, it was very important because there are a lot of, World War II was such a tremendous event. Every country, I don't care what country, was involved in some way, everyone. And the way that Trinidad was involved is right at the beginning of the war, the German submarines were very bold. They were sinking all the ships. They weren't picked up or anything. And one of them was so brazen, he went into the mouth of the Mississippi River, right at the delta, and fired a torpedo at a boat and sunk it there, okay? Sort of closed the port for a while. And I guess the Navy was smart enough to realize what would happen if a Nazi submarine came into the Panama Canal and fired a torpedo at one of those locks, which are very delicate instruments. And so they decided that maybe they had to fortify the area around the Panama Canal. So that was the original thought. And if you remember, when the war started, the Germans, the English negotiated a trade with the United States. We gave them 50 World War I destroyers to protect their convoys, and they gave us some island bases. And what we did was we set up these island bases. Of course, we had one in Panama, we had one in Puerto Rico, we had one in Trinidad, Aruba, and British Guiana, etc. And we formed sort of a circle in the area around the Caribbean. And that's where all the Nazis were sinking all the ships, because they started out making this North Atlantic run, and the Germans sunk everything there. And so they decided to, when they made their runs to England, they would use a southern course. And of course the Germans picked them up right there. And so that we had sort of an umbrella around the perimeter of South America, and it was the job of the Air Force in Trinidad and the other islands to go out and hunt these submarines. And it was slow going, but after a while, they started to knock off a lot of these submarines to a point where the Germans didn't have any submarines left to send into this area. And what they did...
Now you stayed in the Caribbean the whole time?
No. I stayed there about 2 years.
Okay.
And after 2 years, my number finally came up and I got accepted into flying school.
Oh.
So the last 2 years I spent in flying, in and out of flying school. So I was in the service for 4 years.
Now when you got out of the service, you went to the University of Vermont?
I went to the University of Vermont and got a year's credit while I was in flying school. There was a lot of things that they taught us in addition to flying. You had to know some physics, you had to know some English, how to write up a report. There were a lot of things that airplane recognition was very important. They had a little camera like this, and they would flash a picture of an airplane on the screen for about 3 seconds, and you had to identify what the country was and what the plane was and all of that. So there was a lot there, and I got credit for years, which was my junior year. And then I finally got discharged at the end of 1945, and boy, I was gung-ho then. I felt I had missed 4 years of being in business and hearing all these stories, etc., and I couldn't wait till I got out into the business world. And the first job I had, my brother was in the advertising business, and he was doing very well, and he sort of got me a job in the advertising business on Madison Avenue, and I worked there for about 6 months, and I realized I wasn't getting any place. My biggest compensation was getting the key to the executive men's room. That was my biggest compensation. And like most Jewish kids, I wanted to be in my own business, etc. And I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, except I knew I wanted to be my own business. And I decided that that I would manufacture automobile seat covers, which at that time was a big thing. The cars were just starting to be produced. People were buying these cars and they wanted to protect them, and they put seat covers on them, and I was going to manufacture them. And okay, so that's what I decided. And then it was a question of where was I going to set up shop. And naturally, I lived in Brooklyn, I wasn't married, and I looked around Brooklyn and I couldn't find a location that was suitable. So I went to Queens, I went to Staten Island, I don't know where else in New York I went to. Then I went to Philadelphia, looked around there. I went down as far as Wilmington, Delaware. And I just never found the right place. You couldn't find places at that time. It was right after the war, guys were coming back, nothing had been built. It was very difficult. And then I decided, okay, let me try going north. So I went up to Hartford one day, and I looked around in Hartford and I didn't find anything. And I was coming back on the train. In those days, the seats on the New Haven Railroad were just about as good as bleacher seats. And the train is riding, and I'm getting nudgy sitting there on those seats. The train pulled to the staff, and I said, to hell, I'm getting off here and walk around a little bit. And I got off the train, walked around a little bit, met a man, and I asked him, is there any place? He said, yeah, why don't you go across the street and try that place there. You remember Saul Edelman, the pawnbroker? Mm-hmm. Okay, he had a place on Main Street in the Diamond Ice Company building. And there was some new stores being built right across the street, and he was going to move in there, and he was going to move out of that place in the Diamond Ice Company. And it worked out that was a good location. It had the facilities that I needed. I was manufacturing these seat covers, but I had to make patterns. So I had to get cars, take out the seats, make patterns. So I needed a garage or two to be able to work in. So it worked out well. That's how I came to Stanford. If I hadn't gotten off the train that day, I don't know where I would have ended up at, but that's how I got to Stanford.
And was the fellow that you were talking to, was he Jewish or not?
Saul Edelman? No. The man that told me to go to see Saul was an old Italian man that you'd know less. He was in the insurance business.
Capabianca.
not Capobianco, no. Mafucci,
Oh,
okay? Mr. Mafucci was an old man. He had his office in this building upstairs, and I'm not sure, maybe they lived there too. But he took great pride, and he always swept the streets. And the day that I saw him, he was sweeping the streets, you know, around the sewer, cleaning this up. And Mr. Mafucci was the one that pointed me to Saul Everman. I think he had, in fact, I think his son just died. Ambrose, did you know Ambrose?
Yeah.
Okay, he had a son who was also in the insurance business, and I just read recently that he passed away.
Now, where did you live? Now that you had a place to work, where did you live?
That's another story. I still was not married, and I lived in Brooklyn. And every morning I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, take the train to Grand Central Station, take the train to Stamford. That was 2 hours each way. And I worked very hard, especially in those first couple of years. And the hardest work I did was the commuting. Getting up and running at 5 o'clock in the morning and catching the train. I was single. Naturally, I had a social life and probably didn't get home till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. And many of the times I slept on the train and went right to Stanford and got off in Bridgeport or wherever. But those were tough days. And just to continue with this saga, I was in business a little while, and my father, who was a brilliant man, was the vice president of a big factory in Newark, New Jersey, where they manufactured children's dresses and house coats, things that were not expensive, but in order to be able to produce them at a low cost, because they were inexpensive items, you had to have all kinds of special machines to be able to produce them quick enough. And he developed most of the machines. So he was very important. And I was struggling. I was working very hard. And he saw that. And one day he came up to me, he said, "Stan, at the end of the year I'm coming into business with you." And I said, "Dad, you're crazy. Well, here you are, the vice president of a company. You're going to come into a business that's just starting, you know, so to speak." And he said something to me that I'll never forget. He said, "You guys served. Now it's my turn to serve." You guys, meaning my brothers, we had all served. He said, "Now it's my turn to serve." And it's just one of the things I never forgot. Anyhow, he came into business with me and revamped the whole operation, so to speak. And we started to produce and manufacture, and we made covers for lots of outfits. And it was a sewing operation. And after a while, we started to manufacture convertible tops for automobiles, which was a sewing operation. Stanford had a big boat industry. Lots of people owned boats. And we started to manufacture boat tops for boats, boat covers, and all the different canvas items that they use on boats, and plenty of them. And most of the time I spent my time down at the water. And so the business grew, and meanwhile I was still 2 hours a day each day. And one summer, my folks wanted to go to Saratoga. My mother liked to go to the springs in Saratoga. So I closed the shop up for a week and I drove them up there. And I thought I would go to one of these mountain resorts up there. The one that I was heading for was called Scourin Manor, which was in the Adirondacks. And I started to drive there after I had dropped off my folks, and it was getting dark, and I realized I would never get there for a couple of hours yet. So as I'm driving, there was another place called Green Mansions, which I figured, okay, let me stop in here. And as luck would have it, I stayed there. The first night I went to a dance that they had there, met a girl, and the rest, of course, is history. She lived in Albany, and when I wanted to visit her, what I would have to do is I would do my 2 hours up and back every day, and Saturday I closed the shop at 1. I would drive to Albany and drive back Sunday night. And if I wasn't running myself ragged just coming to Stanford, going to Albany too, I just decided all of my friends were getting married and I already was making a living, etc. I decided I'm going to get married. And that's another story. I drove to Albany each weekend and we decided to get married. And Albany is a very political town, run by the Democrats, absolutely 100%. And it's an old city too, with a lot of cobblestones. And we decided to get married, and we were going to get married in a country club right outside of Albany. Well, it just so happens that when God decides to make snow, he says Albany gets it first, okay? So this was January 1st, and I'm driving to this country club with my parents in the evening, and I had been there a day or two before, so I knew where it was. I'm driving and driving in the evening, and I don't pass this country club. How could I miss it, you know? So I turned around, my parents are in the back of the car. I turned around, and I finally find the place. The reason I had driven by is because there was no lights. There was a terrific storm that night.
What year was this?
This was 1949.
49.
Okay? There was a tremendous snowstorm that night, and all the power was out. There was no lights in the country club. There was no heat. All the guests sat in their coats shivering. When they were served the meal was cold. They all wore their coats. Fortunately, there was a fireplace, and they had some candles. There was no photographer, I mean, just nothing there. And yet it was planned for a big wedding. So anyhow, that's how we got married.
So you then moved to Stanford?
Yes, then once I got married, even before then, they were building fair-lawn apartments. And I went in one day and put my name down, and I got an apartment, probably about a month before I got married, so we had a place to go to as soon as we moved in. And I lived there for about 3.5 years, but I had always lived in a private house. My parents always lived in a private house, and I didn't particularly like living in Fairlawn. It was small, so I decided I'm going to buy a house. I started looking, and I never found the one that I liked or could afford. And one day, I don't know why, a fellow came into the store and I was driving him home. And I drove him to his house and I let him off. I said, gee, this is a nice section. If I ever found a place in this section, this is where I would like to live. Okay. A couple of months later, I'm looking around and I see this house that I had let this fellow off at, and right across the street's an empty lot. And there's a sign up there, and I call up the man, I think it was Aaron Weissman's brother or somebody. I call him up and ask him about this lot. And he said, gee, I just sold it. I said, how much did you sell it for? And he told me. I said, how about supposing I give you so much? You know, the deal really hadn't been consummated. He said, okay, I'll try to work it out. And he worked it out and I bought the lot. Now I had a lot and I didn't know what to do with it. So my father, who had a terrific sense of humor, used to tell me, he says, why don't you go there and have a picnic on the subject lot? Okay, anyhow, I decided I can't seem to find a house. I'm gonna build my own house, okay? A friend of mine had hired a builder around the corner and he built his house. So I decided, okay, I'm gonna build a house. Well, I didn't know what kind of house to build, so I started looking in his architectural books. I wanted a colonial. My wife wanted a ranch house, so okay, we settled on a ranch. And one day I'm reading the Sunday Times. At that time it was when they were doing all the building in Long Island, and the real estate pages were full. And I'm looking and I see a layout of a house that looked pretty good. It was out in Westbury, Long Island. So I took a ride out there and I looked at the house and it looked good. And I made a deal with the builder. I bought the plans from him and I took it back to Stanford and I took it to an architect and he redesigned it a little bit. So now I had a house, a lot and a set of plans. Well, what do you do with it now? So I went to a couple of builders and they all quoted me on the house. And God, it's much more than I thought. Well, all you have to do is dare me. So I decided I'm building this myself. And here I was really in a one-man business. And I hired the excavators, I hired the masons, I hired the carpenters, I hired the plumbers. 6 o'clock when I closed the store, I would come down and sort of look and see what they did. Fortunately, my wife's uncle was a European type carpenter. And he built us what I consider the sturdiest house in Stanford. It's not the prettiest, not furnished pretty, but sturdy. This house is sturdy. He did things in this house that I've never seen done in any other house. When they, for instance, when they build a house, they start putting up the foundation, they put up the 2x4s, and then they put in the sheeting. Now, of course, they use plywood. And they graduated to plywood where they use presswood now. What he did is he took tongue and groove wood, and he not only used that for the sheeting, but he put it in on a bias. Now, I don't know if you know what a bias is.
No,
But
the point is that we really want to get back a little bit more toward.
Okay, I'll finish this.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so he put the sheeting in on a bias. And when you put something on a bias, it's twice as strong. So that's how I happened to build a house.
So was Newfield School built?
No, when I first moved in here, there was 2 or 3 houses, and that was the end of the street. About a year later, they came in and started to build a school. And everything over here was all woods. And of course, once the school was built, the place just developed like topsy.
Now, this was woods when you bought your lot?
Yes, my lot was empty, of course. There were 2 houses across the street, and I think 2 or 3 after me. But after that, everything up to Vine Road was all woods.
Now, did you join a synagogue?
We joined Temple Bethel, and I was in Temple Bethel for about 25 years. And then I did a stupid thing, and I left, and I really shouldn't have. But then I joined the Agudah Sholom for a short time, and then I just never really did anything. The way I left Temple Bethel, and I was involved there, and my kids had grown up there and gone to Sunday school and a whole bit. And then my daughter was in college at UConn and met a young man and who wasn't Jewish, and they decided they were going to get married. And I wanted them to get married in my temple, and of course they wouldn't do it, for which I understand. But I just got angry, and as a result, I left the temple, okay?
The other point, in the seat cover, who were the workers? What?
I had the people who started with me, and I don't know if I'm such a good boss or I just don't like to fire people, but I had people who worked for me 20 years, 25 years, some more than that. And those were the workers. They were loyal to me and I was loyal to them.
Now, did you finally retire the business or what?
Well, okay, what happened is I originally started on Main Street in the Ice House, and I should have bought that building, but I never did. And one day I get a letter from the city that I got 90 days to get out. Phew. What do I do now, you know? So I started looking around, and I saw a lot on Richmond Hill Avenue, right across the street from where Stolfi's was. And Stolfi's used to park his trucks there. And I always thought that it belonged to him. But he just used to park his truck there, it didn't belong to him. So I eventually ended up buying a lot, and since I had already built this building, now I'm an experienced builder. So I built a 2-story building on Richmond Hill Avenue, and I moved in there. So I was on Main Street for about 18 years, and on Richmond Hill Avenue for, I think, 23 years. And now we're getting into 1986 already. And things are good, things are fine. Business is starting to change. Healthcare is coming in, and I provided all the healthcare free of charge for the whole family, everybody that worked for me. When I started it, it was pretty inexpensive. By 1986, it got damn expensive. So that was one of the things that I thought of, plus the fact I figured I'd been in business about 42, 43 years, maybe it's time to retire. And I sold the business. And I thought I would retire. And I did the usual things, took a trip to California, cruise and all, for about 3 months, got back and realized, what do I do now? And I had a couple of good customers who used to call me. I did various things. And so I built a little shop in my basement, just as a temporary thing. And I operated out of that until the guys that worked for me, for whatever reason, they left. And so I retired, finally retired. One of the things that I had done when I sold the business was that I had made an agreement that I wouldn't go back into the same business in Stanford. And now I had to get back into business, and what business do I go into? And a lady came into the store one time. She owned a delicatessen on Bedford Street, and she had a chair. And she said, "Stan, could you upholster this?" I figured, okay, let's try it. And we upholstered, it came out good. And little by little, I started to do furniture upholstery. And when I moved out of that shop there, here, I took 2 of my upholsterers with me, and they worked in the basement for me. I had customers like Bloomingdale's, etc. And the business was there, I just didn't want to give it up. One day, one of the fellows who worked for me decided he wanted to retire. And he had a hobby. His hobby was building model airplanes, but not the little airplanes. He built airplanes as big as his house, and they had meats and all of that. That's what he wanted to do. One of the other fellows lived in Bridgeport, and one day he came to me and he said, "Stan, traveling down 95 every day is a big problem getting home in a rush hour." He said, "Why don't you have a shop instead of in the basement? Why don't you have it in Bridgeport, and I'll be right there. I'll open up every day, and you won't have to be so involved." I said, "Fine." So that's what I did. I had a little upholstery shop in Bridgeport. I had it for a long time. And pretty soon I started to branch out. I went into other businesses. I went into the drapery business. I had a shop in Stratford that I still have a little interest in, where I made all the draperies. And then I was doing a lot of traveling, going to Wilton and New Canaan and all. And I made a little arrangement with a fellow in Danbury, and I opened a shop there with him. And finally, the fellow in Bridgeport, who was a Puerto Rican, he went back to Puerto Rico, so I started working with a fellow in Westchester. So I was busy running between the shops. Eventually, I pretty much closed everything. I just have the one in Westchester. And I still do work for people I know and friends, etc.
Now
I don't push it too much.
But your children didn't show any interest in following you.
Well, I had 2 daughters, and one of them wanted to be a nurse. She studied to be a nurse. The other is a concert pianist. So they went their own way. I wish that their husbands had taken some interest. But one of them, the nurse, married a fellow who wanted to go to medical school. He didn't, but that's where his interests were. And the other one lived in California. And I don't know if you know, but people from California don't move east. Easterners move to California, but few Californians move east. So anyhow, that was the story.
Now we come to the critical question, Stan. When did you join the senior men?
The senior men club?
Yeah.
I think it was in I got out of my store in 1987. And Ted Gorman was a good friend of mine. And I admired Ted and Lillian. They were two of my best friends. And we would socialize. And Ted, of course, was very much involved in B'nai B'rith. And he also had joined this club in Stanford. And Ted would come into the store every once in a while, and I would tell him a joke. And he said, "Why don't you join our men's club? You know, we tell stories there every once in a while." So I joined it, and that's when it was in the YMCA. And that was in '88, the year after I sold the business. And I've enjoyed the men's club. I've been I think I held every office except president. I was asked to be president one time and I decided not to. But I've enjoyed it, and then I got involved with this picnic in the men's club. One of the fellows started it and asked me to help him. This was way back. And I helped him out one time, and the next year he died. So there was nobody to run a picnic. I said, "Well, okay, you helped, so you run it." And I started running a picnic, and from a little thing I started to build it up until it really consumed me. I spent a whole year working on that picnic, and eventually I ran, I think, 18 picnics. Should we take a break?
Well, are there things that you want to leave us with? Are there other things that I haven't brought up that you would want to make sure somebody remembers? I certainly don't want to leave you with the men's club. You got to get beyond that.
Well, I wrote something in those notes there that I constantly think of. I grew up in a very tight-knit family. I had two older brothers, and we were very close. And my father was really a brilliant man, and he came to this country with $10 at the age of 13, and came as an immigrant. He graduated from Morris High School, went to law school for a while. He was really a brilliant guy. And I wrote something in there about my parents, that my mother gave birth to a little baby and nursed him and fed him till he was a young man. And my father took that young man and made a man out of him. And if you want me to leave it at, if that's the end, that can be the end.
Well, thank you very much, Stan.
I don't know if you want to end it there, but
Well, we want to talk about Stanford,
yeah, let's
the
talk.
progress.
Well, you might want to point out about how this community has changed, how Stanford has changed since this house was built.
Okay. When I came to Stanford, I believe it had a population of about 65,000.
Mhm.
Today, what have we got? 120 plus, I don't know how many commuters we have coming into Stanford every day. So Stanford has become a small, big city. But what I like about Stanford, it's a very progressive city. Um, we just got finished with Dan Malloy, who was our mayor for 14 years, and I thought he was very progressive and very much on the ball, and I think he helped build Stanford, brought in a lot of companies, did a lot of things that I admired, but the mayors before him were also progressive. And so the city grew, and what I like, of course, is you have everything in Stanford. You have very active recreational facilities. We've got the golf courses and the tennis courses, and we've got the water with the boaters, and we've got many, many activities, swim clubs, etc., that you don't find in many cities. We also have a great deal of industry, not so much manufacturing industry, but at one point, I think Stanford was the third leading city in the United States for corporate headquarters. Many, of course, have moved out since. So Stanford has grown. It's a clean city. As I said, it's very progressive and has lively communities. I appreciate the fact that we have the Jewish center, the Italians have their own center, the Greeks have their own center, and
The Greeks have two centers.
pardon me?
The Greeks have two centers.
The Greeks have two centers. Okay, I don't know what the Haitians, that's for sure, have a center. So we have a lot of things going in Stanford.
Your children went to public schools?
My children went to public school in Stanford. They walked to all three schools. One of my daughters graduated from UConn and became a nurse. My other daughter started to go to school in Bronxville in a school called Sarah Lawrence, which is a very prestigious girls' school. After she was there about a year or so, it was summer break and I sent her to Israel on a B'nai B'rith vacation. She came back and I remember picking her up at the airport, and she was riding in the back seat and I'm driving, and she said, "Daddy, I think I'm going to become Orthodox." And I figured, okay, well, with my daughter, when she says something, she does it. And so she married a young man from California who's Orthodox, and they brought up their kids in the Orthodox tradition. And that's that. I was going to mention something else about
Have you visited Israel?
Pardon me?
Have you been to Israel?
My whole family's been to Israel but me. When I was in business, I always felt I couldn't get away. And now that I'm retired, unfortunately, my wife has some early dementia, and it's difficult to get away. I belong to, through our men's club, Gene Conrad has started a little group for caregivers.
Right.
And I'm involved in that. And so I haven't been to Israel. I haven't done a lot of things, but I have traveled to the national parks in this country. And I firmly believe that before anybody is allowed to go to Europe, they first should visit the national parks in this country. Because the sights you see there, you're not going to find any other place.
I think we want to thank you very much on behalf of the Jewish Historical Society of Lower Fairfield County for really taking the time to talk to us and giving us a fascinating picture of how you have spent your time both in Stanford and before. Thanks a lot.
Okay, I thank you. And I guess now I've got to join the Jewish Historical Society.